Hey guys, it's Bill from Calderwood Percussion. What I have here are two Eames snare drums that were made in the 70s. These came to me from the Calderwood Rangers from Drum Corps. They're some of their old drums that they wanted to have refurbished for rehearsals and just as practice drums. Neither of these drums are in particularly good shape, but also they brought them because they just couldn't make them sound good. And there's a number of things going on with these, but this is something I've seen a number of times with Eames drums in particular, but also a few other older drums that were built when you would definitely be using calfskin heads, especially for rope drums. One of the things with these is the snare beds are super deep on these drums. So when they came to me, in order for the snare side head to conform to the contour of the snare beds, the drum would have had to be under a crazy amount of pressure, and even then there would still be wrinkles around the beds, and it would be really difficult to get the snares to really lay flat and get enough tension on the snare. So basically either the drum would sound really rattly or it would be choked out, because there would just be no way to get good snare response the way the drum was set up. And yeah, you could take a heat gun to the head while it's under tension and get that mylar to reshape a little bit to match the contour of these beds. But on these two drums, the snare beds to begin with, one was just over 3/8 of an inch deep, and on this drum, one of them was almost a ½ inch deep. That's really far, when maybe like 3/16 is what we normally aim for. So with calfskin, it's not that big of a deal, right? Because when you put the calfskin on wet, and it's going to kind of shrink and conform to whatever shape you put it against, and so having a really deep snare bed like this is totally fine. The calfskin will conform to it, and then the deep bed means you get a really articulate snare response. So that's cool, but if you're going to use mylar or any other modern material, you're going to have a problem with beds this deep. I already took them apart. I started working on them, and I realized there's a lot of these old Eames drums around in the fife and drum scene, and maybe some of you guys are running into this problem, so I thought I would tell you what I'm going to do to fix it. Now, my plan for these is pretty invasive. The client is primarily concerned with playability, and they don't mind me doing whatever I feel is necessary to make these drums sound as good as they possibly can. So I'm actually going to remove considerably more material from these drum shells than what I would if it was more of a restoration than a rebuild. Like, this is not like a museum kind of restoration project. For some of you guys out there who might have drums like this, and if you're primarily interested with playability the way these guys are, this might be something that's really informative to you. So like I said, I already started working on these because it didn't occur to me that it might be a cool thing to make a video of until I started digging in. But I'm going to try and do sort of a step-by-step video now of how I'm going to go about solving this problem and what it's going to take to make these drums sound great. The shells are fine. There's a little bit of damage to the 17, but we'll fix that too. So anyway, yeah, that's what the project's going to be. So if you're interested, here we go. So just holding this combo square as straight as I can, you can see that this snare bed is about 5/16 of an inch deep. That's about 1/8 of an inch deeper than what I find usually yields good results. So we're going to need to make this shallower. The only way to do that is to remove surrounding material. Now, we could put this on the sanding table and just sand off some material and bring this down about 1/8 of an inch. I would rather just cut this off and start over. The edges on both sides of this drum need to be addressed, so what we're going to do is just knock this down to where it's flat and cut off a comparable amount from the other side, and that way we can completely start over with the bearing edges. Again, this is a pretty invasive solution to this problem, but given that the client's primary concern is making these drums sound as good as they possibly can, this is the way that I know I can make these drums sound the best. Before I take this shell to the table saw to cut off down the edges, I want to make sure that I have a nice level flat surface to run against the fence. Since obviously we can't do that on the side with the snare beds, we're going to take that off the batter side. So we're just putting this on the sanding table, and all I'm trying to do is get the batter side bearing edge to be a consistent flat surface that is perpendicular to the edge of the shell. Now, if you look at what this batter side bearing edge looks like after it's been on the sanding table, you can see that the light colored sanded area is really inconsistent thicknesses as it goes around the shell. This is part of why I wanted to start over with the bearing edges. Although the bearing edge was in reasonably good shape, it was extremely inconsistent, so the shell was not flat before the bearing edge was cut. Now again, when you're using calf skin, not that big of a deal because the skin will still conform to the shell, whatever shape it is. But since we're not going to be using calf skin, it becomes more problematic. The drum gets harder to tune. So just by leveling this off to give us a nice flat surface to start with, we're going to wind up with a drum that is just a lot easier to tune and hopefully will just sound better. Now that the batter side bearing edge has gone on the sanding table, we've got a nice flat consistent surface to ride against the fence on the table saw. So we're going to begin by lining up the saw blade in the snare bed so that we don't remove any more material than we absolutely have to. So now that there's a nice flat surface on the snare side of the shell from the previous cut, we want to take off the old bearing edge. Now, we don't want to cut off any more material than we absolutely have to, so we're going to just line up the blade right so it just takes off just the material that's cut, and then we'll level it off to cut a new bearing edge. So here you can see these two Eames snare drums with this one. This is a 17-inch drum. We've now removed just shy of 1/4 of an inch material. With this 18-inch snare, had to remove almost at 1/2 an inch to get rid of this snare bed. But now we've got a nice level surface to work with. We can start from here. Now looking at these shells, the two of them were constructed slightly differently. This shell has a steam bent maple re-ring, whereas this shell is laminated. Both shells are made of poplar and maple. So the way it's made with this shell, if you can see if you can look at the edge of the shell, you can see there's the outside ply is a thin veneer of maple that's long grain. Inside there's a thicker ply, a vertical grain ply that is poplar. And then on the inside, again, a very thin maple veneer that's long grain. And then with these steam bent maple reinforcement rings. The whole drum has a scarf joint for the shell, and then also opposite that, the reinforcement ring has a scarf joint, and you can see what Ralph Eames did was here he planed this scarf joint so there wouldn't be a big bump here like on some other drums. Not just rope drums, even like old Ludwig's, Ludwig club date drums, for instance, and some old Sungerlands you'll see, where they didn't plane those down or put them on lathe or anything. Now with this drum, there were big gaps between the plies, especially in the re-ring. So these I filled with a mixture of West Systems epoxy and sawdust that I'd taken from having cut the shell down. With this other 17-inch shell, there's very little gap. There's almost no gap at all on the snare side. On the batter side, the joint is a little bit more open, so we'll go ahead and mix up some epoxy and sawdust to fill that. But otherwise, these edges are pretty flat and true now. We'll put them back on the sanding table briefly, but they're just about good to go. So now I've got some West Systems epoxy and sawdust mixed up into a pretty thick paste, and some painter's tape on the inside and out of the drum shell just to protect the finish, because this can be kind of messy. So we'll take some of this and just work it in, same as you would any other wood putty or wood filler. It's just this epoxy is going to be a much more resilient fill. clean this off. There you go. And just stick a clamp right on there. Be a little bit of epoxy squeeze out, but that's okay. We'll come back and clean that up after. Alright. So while the epoxy is curing on that 17-inch shell, I'm going to see if I can sand down these scarf joints in this rear ring a bit, see if I can just level out that surface a little better. Now that I've kind of cleaned these up with sandpaper, I want to use a card scraper to just make sure I haven't crowned these too much. Scrapers are really great for removing material consistently, card scrapers. And if you use scrapers, I cannot possibly overstate the value of this scraper sharpening tool. It's available from Stuart McDonald. These things are awesome. But anyway, just trying to just take off very, very thin little shavings and just make sure that I've got these leveled off nicely. Okay, so these are all set for bearing edges. The voids have been filled with epoxy. They've gone back on the sanding table a couple of times. They're nice and flat, so the edges are true. And we're ready to cut bearing edges. Now, normally that's a fairly simple process. Generally when I'm making drums, I use laminated shell stock, which means the shell walls with re-rings are a almost perfectly consistent width all the way around. The inside is perfectly round, the outside is perfectly round. I mean, no wooden drum shell is ever perfectly round, but I mean, it's as close as is reasonable to expect. But with this shell construction, that's really not the case. So with both of these, you know, we have this lap joint in the shell, so there's a big bump here on both shells, and then on the inside, with this shell, you know, he's got the laminated re-rings that he made, and because of the way he did it, the innermost part of the rear ring sort of starts as a continuation of the lap joint for the shell. So he's kind of got a scarf cut here, but it's only on the one side. So it's really inconsistent here. The shell plus re-ring most of the way around the drum is about 12 millimeters, and then here at the thickest section, it's almost 15. So that's kind of a lot. Now, with this shell, because we have the steam bent maple re-ring with more of a proper scarf joint, the inside circle is although not round, it's a more consistent surface. Now that matters because we're going to use these router bits to cut the bearing edges, and they have these bearings on them that need to ride against the surface of the shell inside and out. Now, I'm sure we could argue about the historical precedents for different bearing edge contours, but again, this rebuild is all about making these drums sound as good as possible, and this is what I know is going to work. So we're going to use a roundover bit for the outside bearing edge, or the outside of the bearing edge. We're going to use a 45-degree chamfer bit for the inside. Now, because of these big bumps and the inconsistency of the thickness of the shell walls and things like that, it's sort of a trick to figure out exactly how to do this. And it's not just a problem with Eames drums. This is, a lot of old drums are constructed this way. You can see with this old Ludwig that I'm in the process of rebuilding for somebody. You know, where the scarf on this rear ring is, there's a huge bump. The scarf for the shell construction is kind of a mess, and so cutting new edges on this was pretty tricky. But I've come up with a couple ways to handle this situation, where you have inconsistent thickness and a big bump on one side. With this one, where I kind of have a big bump on both sides, it'll be a little bit more tricky. But this is a pretty good example of how to do this. So I choose the side that is going to be worse for the router bearing to ride over, which on this case is the outside, the countercut. So for this roundover, what I'm going to do is cut considerably deeper than what we need. So I'm aiming with these for the apex of the bearing edge to be right around where the re-ring meets the shell wall. But with this I'm going to cut considerably deeper than that. And then I'm going to bring it back when I do the inside cut with this 45-degree bit. Because this will ride much more smoothly, you know, we're going to have a significant inconsistency right here at this bump from the outside cut. But if that cut is too deep all the way around, when I bring it back with this inside cut with this 45-degree, which is again riding on this more consistent surface, I should be able to compensate for that, mostly compensate for that discrepancy caused by this bump, and then I'll be able to smooth out just this corner by hand with sandpaper. But that should give us as consistent an apex right off the router table as what I think is possible, and it'll be a lot closer when it's time to do the hand finishing. So yeah, that's the plan for this one. I think I'm going to use the same approach on this. It's not going to work quite as well, but that's just going to mean a little bit more time with sandpaper. I think that we're still going to wind up with a pretty good result. Okay, we're all set up and ready to begin cutting bearing edges on these shells, but before we actually do that, I wanted to bring up one more thing. Now, if you've done any woodworking work with the router table, you know that the safest way to approach the router bit with your workpiece is to push the workpiece into the direction that the bit is spinning, so that the blades on the bit come through and carve off wood from the workpiece. When working with laminated shells, laminated shell drums, however, that can be problematic. When the exterior ply of the drum shell is a veneer that's particularly thin, or if you don't know what the wood is, or if you don't know what kind of glue they use, it's old, there's a lot of variables there that can provide significant opportunity for the router bit to actually rip off large chunks of the exterior ply, the veneer, as it's passing rather than just cutting it, which is generally not impossible to fix, but it will definitely ruin your day. So when working with laminated shell drums, for at least the first pass on the bearing edges, I often prefer to do climb cuts, which means moving the workpiece with the direction that the bit is spinning rather than into the direction of rotation. Now, this is dangerous. It's dangerous because the tendency will be for the machine to actually grab the workpiece and pull it out of your hands. If that happens, best case scenario is the workpiece goes across the shop and gets damaged, but the more likely worst case scenario is you will also be prone to very serious injury. So if you're going to do that, you have to make sure that you have full control over the workpiece, you're really paying attention. But with the drum shell like this big, you know, I'm already physically pretty far away from the blades, and because you're going with the direction of the bit, there's very little opportunity for the bit to tear off chunks of veneer. So it's safer in that regard, whereas you're much less likely to damage your workpiece. What I often will do is a couple of passes climb cutting, we're bringing the bit up to what the final depth is going to be, and on the very last pass, just bring it up just a hair, and then go cut it conventionally going into the direction of the bit, so that last pass, you know, gives you that smoother finish that you don't necessarily get when climb cutting. So again, with these drums, they're pretty old. I mean, I know this is maple, but I don't know how it's applied, and you know, there's just a lot of opportunities here for me to do damage if I'm not careful. So I am going to climb cut the first cuts on these shells, but again, in order to do that, you really got to have control of your workpiece. You really got to be careful. So that's what I'm going to do. Okay, so the edges are cut on both drums, and I think that went as well as it could have. On the 17-inch drum, the apex is actually really pretty consistent all the way around. Even at this big lap joint here, there's a little bit of a bump on the apex, but it's going to be easy to clean up. Obviously, we'll have to clean up this on the outside, but the apex itself all the way around is pretty smooth. And this maple cut just beautifully that's going to turn out great without too much work. This 18, on the other hand, is a little bit of a mess because of the way he laid up the plies to construct this. It's alternating plies of maple, and then vertical grain poplar, and then maple all the way through, except for these the inside plies on the rear rings, which are oak for some reason. But otherwise, it's thin maple, thick vertical poplar, thin maple, alternating all the way across. So you wind up with all these thick plies of poplar and end grain. So that on the router is going to be pretty rough. But there's stuff we can do to mitigate that. The bigger issue is these joints. But I think we can get away with, on the bottom of the drum, locating the snare bed there to sort of mitigate that problem entirely. So anyway, yeah, I'm happy with how that went. I think it went as well as it could have. We just have a little bit of cleanup to do. So on to the next step. So the next step for these is layout. I'm not going to add any hardware to these, so it's really just a question of locating the snare beds. Now, normally what I like to do is make sure that the seam goes under a rope, just to obscure that a little bit, and I put the vent holes evenly spaced in between ropes, just so it becomes a decorative element as well. With these, the vents are just arbitrarily placed, but the seams we can go ahead and put behind ropes. Now, normally I like to lay it out so that the seam is behind a rope and also against the player's body when the drum is on a strap. But again, because what we want to do is get rid of some of this big bump from the joint on the snare side, we're going to go ahead and locate this seam under the rope that is right at the snare strainer. Now for this drum, at one point this had a butt plate that was used on it. The client isn't using that piece of hardware anymore, but I'm still going to locate the snare bed there just in case someone ever chooses to convert this back to its original setup. So we're kind of stuck with where the snare beds go on this drum, but on this 18, we can go ahead and locate them right under this big bump, so that we can kind of remove that from the equation here. So here we go. So in the past, I've always cut snare beds by hand, which I like to do, but as I've been getting more orders where I'm building like complete drum lines, 3 or 5 or 7 snares, and I want them all to be as consistent as possible, so that to get consistent tuning across the whole line is easier to do. I've been trying to make sure that all my processes are as repeatable as possible, because it's natural materials, it's wood and things like that. No two drums will ever be exactly the same, but I want to try and minimize variables for whoever the drumline tech is who's trying to tune these things and get a consistent pitch. So repeatability with snare beds is a thing that I've decided that I really shouldn't be doing this by hand in these cases, and I really should make myself some kind of snare bed jig. So this is what I came up with. This is the first project that I'm using this on. This is based on the snare bed cutting jig that Eric Soy at Black Swamp made. This is a lot longer and sort of more geared towards field drums, but it works on the same principle. So we have this acrylic template that'll ride against the bearing on this pattern bit, and these templates I just make on the laser cutter. So like this one is for a 14-inch radius. The one that's on here is for a 16-inch radius, and I've got a few others that I've made or am making, where some of them have flat bottoms, or some of them are like a larger, smaller radius, or it's like some vintage cuts to match some older drums. So these are just really easily interchangeable with these 2 bolts, and then you just clamp the drum to this sled and run it across the router. And I've done a few test cuts with some scrap shells, and so far it's working really well. So I'm excited that this is the first project I get to use it on. So here we go. Okay, so now that the bearing edges are cut, the snare beds are cut, it's time to do the final kind of dressing by hand. So to do that, I use mostly sandpaper. I like this 3M stuff that's on a very flexible plastic back, because it'll contour to pretty much anything. It lasts a long time. So I use 220 and 320, and I wrap it on foam sanding blocks so it'll contour to the edge. For things like this where we have a seam where there's like more material that has to be removed, I usually use a combination of a luthier's rasp and a very, very, very sharp chisel. And then for the inside cut, which is just that flat 45, where there's bumps, I try to do it all just with a card scraper, because that way I can keep it as flat as possible. Sometimes I have to use sandpaper too. And then at the snare beds, to kind of round them off, hopefully I can just do it with sandpaper. Sometimes you need to break out the rasp for that, because we do want to sort of like smooth those over. So yeah, this is just kind of a hand thing. You just sort of until it feels right, you know. But basically you just want it as all as smooth and consistent as possible. So that's what I'm going to do now. Okay, so now that the edges and beds are cut, everything's dressed, totally finished and ready to go, I want to seal up these bearing edges. The insides of both of these drum shells are completely unfinished. That's not the way I do it when I make drums, but you know, it's how these were made, and I'm going to go ahead and leave them that way. But I do want to seal up the edges. I think that it helps with a couple of things. I think just having the edges sealed helps just to sort of protect the wood against moisture that can build up, like that gets trapped in between the head and the wood, just to kind of protect the wood from that. You know, the more you can keep moisture out of the wood, the less the shell is going to move with humidity changes, the more stable the tuning is going to be. And just in general, kind of like seal things up and just give it a little bit of protection. I think that's really helpful. So I'm going to use boiled linseed oil, which is kind of my go-to for if I want something that's just going to kind of seal and protect the wood, but not like an aggressive finish or a heavy finish. So I'm going to do that, and then once that's settled, I'll just go over it once with paste wax, and that should help the heads move smooth and keep everything just sealed up and protected. So that's what we're doing. Boiled linseed oil you just apply with a rag or a sponge or whatever to the wood. Let it soak in and kind of do its thing, usually for maybe 10 minutes or so, and then come back with a dry, clean cloth, wipe off all the excess. And that's pretty much it. If you feel like the wood still has some dryness to it, you want to add a second application, you can. But that's all there is to it. And the nice thing about this is maintenance is super easy. The oil itself is very inexpensive, and if at some point later on you feel like the wood's kind of drying out or needs a little bit more protection, you just apply it again exactly the same way. And that's really all there is to it. I'm going to do the rear rings too, but not the inside of the shell. Alright, that's it. Let that sit for a few minutes, then wipe it off. In the meantime, I'm going to do the rest of the edges on these. So one other thing, if you're using boiled linseed oil, this is very important. You can't just throw away the rags that you use. When linseed oil dries, it generates a lot of heat, and a pile of oily rags just left will catch fire. Like that will spontaneously combust. You know, one rag like this, probably not enough to start a fire, but all the same, you just want to like lay them out or hang it over the edge of the trash can so it's laid out and can dry. You know, a lot of guys that I know work at wood shops will just keep a bucket of water if they're going through a lot of rags. Just keep a bucket of water and just throw them in there, and then just you know, at some point, you know, at the end of the workday, lay them out somewhere so that they dry. And this is not a weird edge casey thing. Like a pile of rags soaked in linseed oil will start a fire. So it's just something you got to be careful of with the gloves you use and the rags. Just lay them out. If it's just laid out flat, you know, yeah, it'll generate heat, but not nearly enough to cause a problem. But a pile of oily rags will absolutely spontaneously combust. So you just got to be careful about that. So for this job, the client said to not worry about anything aesthetic with these instruments, but only repair stuff that would directly impact playability and make the drums sound as good as they possibly can. Don't do anything else. So for instance, you know, now in talking with the client a little bit more, you know, there's some cracks in the 17-inch drum, but the shell is still stable, like they're not going to get worse. So we're going to leave those alone. I'm looking at the hoops, you know, the hoops for the 17, they're stained with what looks like a polyurethane finish. They're a little beat up, but like overall they're okay. There's nothing going on here that's really going to affect playability. They're fine. The wood's protected well enough. These painted hoops, however, the wood, the paint is pretty chipped, leaving some areas of wood exposed, and also they just kind of look terrible. And while aesthetics were obviously, you know, not a priority here, we both kind of agreed that like this paint should probably go, and just do something simple to just to seal and protect the wood. The other thing is, I don't like painted hoops for rope tension drums. Just, no matter what I do, some amount of paint rubs off on the rope. There's just so much tension on snare drums. Some of the paint's going to rub off on the rope, and it's just it drives me nuts. So anytime I can get away with not painting rope drum hoops, I'm all about it. So we're going to go ahead and strip these. Now, the best way to do that, in my experience, is with heat. I don't like chemical strippers just because I don't ever really have good results with them. I'm not saying they don't work, I'm just saying that for some reason they don't work for me. So I start with a heat gun and a scraper, get as much off as I can, and then go from there. Now the goal is always to remove the paint, but remove as little wood as we possibly can. So that's what we're going to try and do. So now that I've removed most of the paint from the surface of the wood using a heat gun scraper, I'm going to use card scraper and a palm sander to get it down the rest of the way. Now again, trying to remove as little wood as possible, but there's also kind of a lot of kind of gouges and scrapes on these just from years of damage that we're going to try and smooth out too. So we'll just do that all at once. So here we go. Okay, so these hoops are stripped and sanded and prepped as good as they're going to get. The wood on these is still not in awesome shape. I think because they were originally intended to be painted, it wasn't like the highest grade wood to begin with. So anyway, I've prepped them as much as I feel comfortable doing. I don't want to, like I said, I don't want to remove too much material. So I'm going to dye them a dark brown. So I used a couple different kinds of wood dye, mostly transcendent color tone, which you can mix with either water or alcohol and kind of use whatever whatever is going to work best, depending on whether you're applying by hand or spraying or whatever. But for times when the wood is kind of beat up and I want it to be a dye, you can still kind of see the grain, but it's a really sort of a more aggressive dye that kind of obscures some of the imperfections of the wood. I like to use this Eames leather dye. I use their black dye a lot because when it goes on wood, it comes actually black instead of looking like kind of purplish like you use the Sharpie. But I use the brown dyes a lot too, again, when I want something that's just sort of a more aggressive dye that's going to help to sort of obscure some of the imperfections of the wood. And I like to apply it with these little puffball brush things that also I got from Tandy Leather. I'm not really sure what they are, but they're for applying dye to leather, I guess. But I like them a lot for using this kind of dye with wood. So we're going to go ahead and do it. And then once the dye is on the surface, any excess we'll wipe off with paper towels. We'll let that sit for a while, and then just use a wipe-on polyurethane to finish it. So here we go. Okay, so these are ready to assemble now. This video was just going to be about dealing with the snare beds and bearing edges, but now that we've kind of gone this far, I figure why not finish it out. So, so for rope, the rope on these was done. I mean, it was really frayed at the edges and pretty trashed. And yeah, it wasn't probably gonna break soon, but I mean, you're going all this trouble, you may as well replace the rope. My preference is 3-strand filament polyester from New England Ropes. The filament polyester, as opposed to the spun polyester, has the lowest elasticity that I've found in any 3-strand line, which is great because the lower the elasticity, the better the tuning stability is going to be, the less you're going to have to pull tension back into the drum. I like to get this from R&W Rope, which is actually just south of our shop. The only real remaining question is how much rope do you need per drum? And it's actually really easy to measure. So this is a 10-hole drum, and we're just going to, with the hoops on and oriented so that the holes are opposed to one another, we measure, and it's about 20 inches from hole to hole. So since this is a 10-hole drum, that means the rope is going to pass 20 times, right? So 20 inches times 20 times around the drum is 400 inches. So that's about 33, 34 feet. But then you got to add extra for tying it off and the drag rope, and just make sure that you have enough for the rope passing over and under the hoops every time. Add a few inches, and I usually add at least 5 or 6 feet. So with this, I cut 40 inches of rope, and that's probably going to be a couple of feet too many. I'm not really sure, but I would rather have a little bit of excess at the end than cut it too short and wind up having to start over. And then the last thing is, it's definitely worth actually making an eye splice rather than tying this or sewing it or any of the other ways. And making an ice splice is really not difficult at all. There's like a million videos on YouTube that will show you how to do this. It's way easier than it looks. Just search for a video on YouTube. It's super easy to do. Yeah, time to put it together. So this 17-inch drum is all assembled and tensioned and is pretty much at what its final pitch is going to be. For me, I always have way better luck if I get the drum as tight as it's going to be before I set up the snares, because depending on how much tension there is on the drum, how far the flesh hoop is away from the bearing edge of the snare bed is going to change. So I want the snares to contour to what this break angle is actually going to be. So it's important that you get some tension on there first. Okay, so first thing to do is if you get your snare gut from Cooperman or from Matt at Connecticut Percussion, or if you just get it straight from Pakistan yourself, it's almost always going to be coated with what I think is shellac. I'm not really sure. But either way, it makes it so that when you soak the gut to get it pliable, it becomes very inconsistently pliable, and I have a lot of trouble setting it up. So you got to get that shellac off. I like to use acetone. So the first thing I'm going to do is get some acetone on a rag and just wipe these snares down to get that layer of what I think is shellac off them. And then we're going to put these in warm but not hot water, let them soak for a little while. And then while we do that, we're going to have to do a little work on the snare setup. So the actual snare strainer on this drum had been replaced at some point with one of these Cooperman Civil War style strainers. These are okay, but if you get one of these, you got to do a little work on it before you can really use it. So I'm going to go over that in a second. And they also come with these leather snare anchors that are punched for 4 snare strands. I don't really like these. The way they're punched makes it hard for me, at least, to get the snares to lay nice and evenly spaced, and they're kind of too pliable, and they only allow for 4 snare strands, and I prefer 5 on a 17-inch drum. So yeah, so we're not going to use this, but I'll get to that in a second. First, I'm gonna clean and soak these snares, and while they soak, I'm going to go ahead and fix up this snare strainer so we can actually use it. Cool. So let me show you how we do that. So there are a couple problems with these strainers that we should fix. The functional problem is that these holes that are not threaded but just pass-throughs, they're never quite, either that they're not, the sizing's wrong or the spacing's wrong, but it makes it very difficult, even with the screws backed out like this. This pinch bar, you really kind of have to fight with it to get it to move, and that makes setting up the snares kind of a pain in the ass. So just drilling out, removing the screws and taking this apart, and then drilling out these holes solves that problem. And it's real quick and easy to do. So put it off. And that's all it takes. Now the screws pass through much more easily, and that's going to make setup on this a lot easier when we get there. The next issue is, I'm not sure who Koopman gets these from, but the way they're manufactured, you have this steel bit of threaded rod and this bronze finial or whatever. It's attached with a roll pin, but it's also soldered in there. And every one of these that I've seen has had a ton of corrosion at the joint. I assume it's because whoever makes these doesn't clear out the flux after soldering them. So you get a lot of corrosion in there. It's not like it's ever really going to eat through, but it's still just, you know, it is damaging the metal, and it really doesn't look very nice. And the other issue is down here. These are just ground with a, I mean, I clearly didn't go on a lathe. But you always wind up with a lot of oxidation down here, just a lot of rust. So we want to clean that up, and then we want to protect this metal. And it's also, while we're at it, it's nice to just go ahead and polish off this bronze just to look nice. But we definitely, we want to get rid of this rust and corrosion, and we want to protect the metal just so this part lasts and functions for a long time. You don't wind up with it binding up. This kind of, if it grows too much, it'll bind up in the socket, and it functions a lot better if the parts are cleaned and properly lubricated. So that's what we're going to do. So I just use a wire brush to clean these up. This is a fairly soft brush, and I'll just go ahead and use that on the whole piece. Even the bronze, I mean, these castings are fairly rough, so it's it's not like you're scratching up anything that's doesn't already have a pretty rough texture to begin with. So yeah, just a real quick touch on the brush, and this will be ready to go. So now to finish up on these parts, I've got coarse and fine polishing compound, and then on here I've got a wax, which will put a protective coating over the metal. So here we go. One last step before applying the wax. We want to get rid of the residue from the polishing compound, so we'll do that with acetone. So instead of this leather piece, I make these wooden ones. These are just drum shell, like little segments of drum shell. So they're already radiused. And I laser cut them.
so they're all like perfectly consistent, and that way I can just do a bunch of them all at once. But honestly, it's pretty easy to just measure and drill, and you can space them however you want. If you don't have any drum shell stock laying around, I mean, you just 1/4-inch plywood. You could radius it with just putting sandpaper against the hoop and rubbing this, or even don't radius it. It would still work fine. But so this is what we're going to use, and now this gut has been soaking for I don't know, 10 or 15 minutes. You don't want it to soak too much, because then it'll swell a lot, and then it's difficult to get it through the holes. And you just want it so it's you know, very, very like pliable. And then if the ends, if any of the ends are too fat to go through the holes, I'll just cut with scissors, cut a little taper, and that usually does the job. So we'll lace this up. So next we're going to thread these through the snare gates, being careful to keep them in order so the snare guts themselves will lay flat. Now double check that they came through in the correct order. Checking one more time to make sure that they are in the correct order, so that they'll lie flat. Alright. Now we're going to put on the pinch bar. I usually just put a screw through one side. Of the bar, and thread it just a little bit, so I can take this and just slide it right across. Now with these strainers, they're really only meant to accommodate 4 strands rather than 5. So you kind of have to squish them in there a little bit. But if you are patient and fuss with it, you'll get it to fit. And then get the other screw in. Tighten these just tight enough that there's friction when you try and pull. When you try and pull it's pulling on the gut. So now we want to try and make sure that we have them as equally tensioned as possible before putting on the screw for the snare strainer. First thing I usually do at this point is apply a little bit of white lithium grease to the threads and some here on the end where it's going to go into the socket. Now we want to set this up so that the pinch bar will have room to go in both directions. So there will be room to both tighten and loosen the snares. So we'll set it kind of in the middle of the sort of hypothetical travel between bumping up against the flesh hoop and where you run out of threads. And now pull the snares tight and tighten these screws a little bit more. Go. Now, starting from the middle, we'll go through and pull the snares individually and try to get the tension as even as possible. Feel across the top. Seems like we're in pretty good shape. Tighten this. Another full turn. And then tighten the screws in the pinch bar the rest of the way. Now this should do the trick, but I don't like to trim the ends of the snares until the snares have dried and I can play the drum and make sure that it actually sounds the way I want to. Just in case we have to take this apart and do it again, I want to make sure that I still have plenty of ends on these guts so that if I have to take it all apart and do the whole process again, it'll still, I won't be running up against having too small of an end to get it to tighten up in this pinch bar. So now we let it dry. Well, now both these drums are totally ready to go, and there's just two little sort of finishing tips that I thought I'd share with you. The first is, so what do you do with the end of the drag rope? Because masking tape doesn't look good even if it's not blue. I don't know. So what I've come up with is using white heat shrink tubing. You can get it in big rolls. It's pretty inexpensive. So I just cut off a piece. Work down the excess rope. Put it right about where I'm going to cut the rope. Then shrink it. I like to use a heat gun. You can use a match or a torch, but it'll just color the heat shrink a little bit. Cut the rope. Hit it with the heat one more time. And now that's all set. The other thing I like to do with these muffle strips, I hate just leaving them like this.
They get dirty and they get frayed, and I think they look terrible. So I like to sew them up so that what you wind up with is something shorter and neater. It can't fray, and then also you have something to kind of hold on to if you want to pull on the muffler to adjust it. So I just fold it over and over again at the end, and kind of just give myself a little handle that's about between 1/2 and 3/4 of an inch. And then I just sew that on, kind of like a wide, like basting stitch. That's what it's called. Looks much nicer, and you have something to grip if you want to pull it and adjust it. Alright, these drums are all set, ready to go. This video ended up being a little bit more kind of involved than what I set out to do, but I really hope that you found it to be informative and helpful. If you have any questions about anything that I did, please feel free to send an email or hit the comments below. And if you have any instruments that you're working on, I'm always happy to give advice on how you can do this stuff yourself. Or if you'd like to have me do some work for you, I'm more than happy to do that. Just drop me a line. I feel really good about how these turned out, given that they came in basically unplayable, and they really sounded great now. I think this was really successful. So thank you so much for watching, and we'll catch you next time.